Hey everybody, this is Count MRVHS. Welcome back to the library tour. Today we are looking at Byzantine, Viking, and Anglo-Saxon history books that I own. And I should preface this by saying, as I have several times already in the series, that the catalog, the organization system that I've used here is something that I'm in the process of revisiting. So I've got actually a rather sparse looking history section for Anglo-Saxon stuff, despite the fact that I have quite a large section of Anglo-Saxon or Old English literature and language related things. And where you draw the line between those topics is rather debatable. So I am in the process of rethinking this. But for now, this is what we're going with, and I wanted to continue this. So we're starting with Byzantine stuff at the top, and I also wanted to take maybe a minute or two to talk about that word Byzantine, because this has come up in some discussion on the Fourth Age Discord lately. Some interesting discussion there about the word. What should we use with reference to the Byzantines or the Eastern Romans? Should we call them Romans? Should we call them East Romans? What should we do? Should we even use like the actual Latin word or the Greek version of that Latin word? I'm going to just continue to use Byzantine here. That's what I've gotten used to. And it's really for the same reason that I pronounce it Paris, right, rather than using the correct French pronunciation. You use the words that you're used to, and then if you are exposed to a different environment, let's say, you may modify and change those words that you use. I just grew up at a time where Byzantine was sort of the default. That was what they were called in Age of Empires 2. That's what they were called in Medieval Total War. I got very used to that, and a lot of the sort of generalized history books that I read reinforced that term. I also really like the word. There is an aesthetic appeal to the word Byzantine. It's a little unusual from the English perspective. Just the consonants that are sort of clustered there, the letter Z, of course. And, it reminds us of the locality of Byzantium before it was, Constantinople, before Constantine's day. So there are some interesting reasons maybe to, to talk about changing that, using a different term, but I'm just going to continue to use what I'm familiar with. So to start with here, we have really a section of books that are really the same book, and it begins with this, at least in my exposure to it. This is A Short History of Byzantium by John Julius Norwich. And this is the short version of the 3-volume expanded edition, which is, these are the original books, divided into 3. We've got the early centuries, the apogee, and the decline and fall. And but this was the first one I read. Probably picked it up at Borders about 20 plus years ago. And Norwich is really a fantastic writer. These are extremely entertaining. This is essentially if Edward Gibbon were a little more, modern, a little maybe less loquacious, and far more sympathetic to the Byzantines, because this is a very pro-Byzantine book. So that said, it is great for what it is. It gives you a narrative history, just a straight up overview. His sympathies are extremely clear, so you know where you stand with Norwich at all times with regard to the characters he's discussing, with regard to the theological debates that he describes. So there are biases for sure, but I appreciate it when those biases are clear at least, and it doesn't feel like he's weaseling around and trying to slip in propaganda. The propaganda is very obvious. So I found these extremely entertaining. If you get a chance, definitely pick them up. The thing that I found most moving about this was a story about the fall in 1453, where you have this series of, I think it's a group of people, some Venetians, or they're trying to get to Venice to see if help is coming, essentially. The siege is going poorly. And they sail out, they sneak through the blockade that the Turks have established, and they manage to learn that there are no reinforcements coming. The city is on its own. And they have a choice at that point, right? Like the crew could just say, well, all right, let's go and live in Italy, somewhere more safe, right? but they decide to come back and tell the besieged, defenders of Constantinople that no help is coming and this is the end. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that brings a tear to your eye, right? Like, I don't know how true it is. Norwich presents it as though it is a completely true story. And so if you like things like that, there's a lot of them here. I think the thing that I would say, of course, is you have to be a little cautious. This is a sort of a grand narrative history with clear biases that is intended for a general audience, but it is written very, very well. So highly, highly recommend. And this is a case where when I read the abridged version and realized that, he had a 3-volume version, I had to get them eventually and read through them all, even though I'd read this. So absolutely recommend John Julius Norwich for Byzantium. Here is another pretty clearly biased one. This is 1453 by Roger Crowley. The Holy War for Constantinople and the Clash of Islam and the West. And so this is, let me check the date on this, because Norwich was writing, I want to say in the 1980s or in the 1990s, but this is later. This is 2005, right? And so when you're considering when these were written, you always want to think of the historical context. So this is only 4 years post 9/11. There is a very clear interest in books around that time of presenting this East-West dichotomy and trying to look back and maybe make a claim that the same sort of animus that was motivating the feel of, East versus West in the beginning of the 21st century had an origin centuries or even millennia earlier. So this is one of those books. It falls squarely into that camp of setting up a, East versus West. And we could certainly complicate that story with other sources. But this one was, again, a fun read if you know sort of what the author is trying to do and you're aware that there is going to be I guess I could say a bias, right? But more importantly, a simplification, because he's interested primarily in telling a narrative, telling an exciting story about the siege, about that year. And so it succeeds on that, on those grounds. It really does read, the blurbs on the back of the book say it's like a historical fiction novel, and it kind of is in the sense that there is a strong reference to, establishing characters and motivations and things. But, again, very enjoyable for someone who wants a fairly light read, but the one that's going to get your blood up, I guess. So it's an entertaining one for sure. We've got some very slender books here. This one's kind of fun because I got this one for free. Byzantium, a very short introduction. It is very short indeed. I got this for review purposes, actually, for Medieval Warfare magazine. They were several years ago having a sort of a system whereby they were looking for people to do short reviews of books, and they'd send you the book if you did one. So I did that, and you can find my review of it somewhere in Medieval Warfare magazine. It's fine. This is a fine book. It is a very short introduction. It's about a grand total of 130 pages or so. And so the author here has just enough time to bring up things that would really probably get about this many pages if they were given a fuller treatment. So it's fine. It's a great overview. You sort of wonder what the purpose is or who the intended audience really is for a book like this. I guess the idea is that this is for maybe students who are in a kind of a survey class. I have a hard time seeing the point of such classes, I suppose. If I wanted a sort of general introduction, I would want something that's more captivating, right? Something that's going to get a student's attention and keep it and sort of continue to feed them bits of information, kind of like Norwich's series, which I guess you can't, assign that in a introductory course or anything, but it's kind of a shame because the very brief introduction books just seem like short but boring, right? So it's kind of the worst of both worlds. But that one it's fine. It's fine. Here we've got another sort of great courses accompanying text, World of Byzantium. This is another Kenneth Harl course, if you're a fan of his, as I am. Again, sort of an interesting series of lectures on the Byzantine Empire. And, a great overview again. The book itself just comes with the courses. I've never actually read it, but I did look at the lectures. All right, this one is very interesting. Edward Luttwak's The Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire. And for this one, I suppose it's somewhat controversial maybe to say that there was a grand strategy. He did another book on the Roman Empire, and I think he talks about the grand strategy of the Roman Empire as a whole, but primarily, earlier on. I think he was focusing more on the Republic era. And I remember reading some criticism about this, which suggests that maybe there wasn't really any grand strategy, and to talk about it is a little misleading. Nevertheless, I found this very interesting because it goes over Maurice's Strategicon, I believe it is. And so you get exposed to a series of texts that are, primary sources essentially, and he's walking you through them and telling you interesting things about like how the military was organized and how the cavalry was armed, things like that. So it's good at that sort of micro level. He talks about strategy. He talks about tactics a little bit. He talks about the grand strategy in the sense of alliances and how the Byzantines were very adept at allying with the tribe beyond their neighbors so that they could work in tandem with them to sort of, if needed, destroy that border power right on their doorstep. So it was an interesting read for that. It's been a while since I've visited it. This is a kind of a book that I don't know that I would reread anytime soon, simply because it is fairly dense, but it is interesting if you're into that sort of thing. I clearly was at some point, because I have ended up with several books on Byzantium. So this is another one I haven't read, Mark Wittau's The Making of Byzantium, 600 to 1025. I was going to say 1205. That doesn't sound right, because 1204 we had a rather important event. But regardless, 600 to 1025. So I guess that's Basil II. Is that right where he was? This is a book that I haven't read. I don't even know if I've really started it. And it is now several decades since it has been published. Okay, 1996 was when it was published. So this is one that, I could see myself revisiting. This is a more scholarly text than Norwich's. And that's in fact the problem, because I don't know that I would ever have a scholarly desire to get into Byzantine stuff. I just like reading about it because it's fun. And so Norwich is kind of my go-to for when I want to revisit the drama and the excitement of, the Byzantine military campaigns or something. But this is a much more probably useful text for a serious student, I would say. That's certainly how it is presenting itself. One of only a couple of what you might call primary texts that I own regarding the Byzantines is this one, Michael Sellis's 14 Byzantine Rulers. And I remember being impressed by this, about how absolutely bitter he was. This is one of those historians who was writing about stuff that was in his time frame, right? And he had very strong feelings about many of the people he's writing about here. And he has very clear aims. And I can't remember what I felt about him, whether he was justified, whether he was being a bit overly dramatic at times in his criticism of various emperors and empresses. But regardless, it's interesting to have, an original source so close to the things he's actually writing about. As you can see, it didn't get very far in this, if this bookmark is any indication, but about maybe halfway through the text. At a certain point, Sellis is a little grating, I think, and I found myself going for more modern summaries of Byzantine history. The other text I have is more interesting, and it is one I have read. It's I think it's later, though. It is Digenis Acritus, the Two-Blooded Border Lord, which is something of like a Byzantine epic. We'll get to it eventually. It's one of the only like Byzantine texts that I own that is sort of literary in nature. But this one is another military one, The Byzantine Art of War by Michael J. Decker. I think I've flipped through this, haven't gotten very far in it yet. The next time I fire up a Byzantine's Total War, campaign, I will probably get into it. This is one that goes into sort of more Osprey level detail, I suppose, about things like armor and weapons and strategy and things like that. So it seems pretty promising from that regard. And speaking of Osprey stuff, we've got a bunch here. Let's see. And some of these are only tangentially related to the Byzantines, but I didn't know of anywhere else to put them. Medieval Russian fortresses, AD 862 to 1480, a very interesting one. I'm not going to go into great detail about all of these. I'll just sort of hit some of the highlights. Armies of medieval Russia. Great art. So this is Angus McBride, right, doing the art here. I'm going to point that out every single time because he's awesome. What is this? Hungary and the fall of Eastern Europe. So this is a very strange one. You'll notice the time spread here. 1000 to 1568 is kind of broad, but it's got Angus McBride artwork in it, so it's going to be good. We've got some, Varangian stuff. The Varangian Guard, 988 to 1453. Who is this? Is this Embleton? No, Giuseppe Rava. So he's done a few others as well. And this is pretty good. Let's see. Byzantine. So here's the actual Byzantine stuff. Byzantine infantrymen, Eastern Roman Empire, circa 900 to 1204. So this is, the mid-period, you might say. And this one I remember as being pretty good, a pretty solid one. Byzantine army. So this is the late period, right? 1118 to 1461. Late-ish, I guess. 1118 isn't too late, but basically, post-First Crusade anyway. And Byzantine infantrymen, 912. Did I already go through this one? Oh, Byzantine cavalrymen, that's right. So this is the companion to the infantrymen one. So 900 to 1204. Another Giuseppe Rava, I would say. Is that right? Yeah. So these are all good, right? These I've got them because they're all decent. They do what you would expect from an Osprey book, which is give you some nice pictures and some context for them. This is probably one of the more interesting books on this shelf. Now, it's how Byzantine is it? I don't know, but that's why I've kind of got the Vikings coming up right below it. This is the Varangians of Byzantium by Sigfus Blondel. And so a guy with a name like that is the kind of guy that I want writing a book about the Varangians of Byzantium. We've got Benedict Benedicts, who's doing the translation and rewriting of it. It says translated, revised, and rewritten by this guy. So there is an interesting textual history to this book, no doubt. I don't know all the details of it. I have not completed this book, but I love the detail. It is slow going because of that. He spends a lot of time describing things, talking about the names of places. He has a very interesting discussion on the cataracts on the river Dnieper, is it? Or the Don? I can't remember. But he talks about these basically these rapids that have to be navigated if you're going to follow the river system down to the Black Sea. And they all have interesting names, and I've pointed these out. These are fantastic names that seem to mean things like shouter, never navigable, never passable, whirler, laughing or laughter, wolf's mouth. So anyway, some interesting things just about place names there. And the fact that they spend so much time discussing those things, I find really interesting. And then he gets into the specifics. So the part where I got bogged down actually is probably what many people would consider is the most interesting part, which is Harold Sigurðarson. And so, I don't know. I think I've just seen his story retold many times. So a lot of this is just revisiting things that I'm already somewhat familiar with. But then he gets into, past that, a sort of general overview of the Varangians between these very specific time frames. Here he's looking at this roughly 40-year period between 1042 and 1081. Then he goes from there up to 1204, and then from 1204 to 1453. And this section is "The Ghost of the Regiment" is the title of that chapter. So it gives you a sense of the duties of the Varangian Guard, like how close were they to the imperial court, what was the purpose, and then what are some individual Varangians and travelers, and then a section on runic inscriptions. So there's a lot of interesting detail here on the Varangians of Byzantium. So I recommend it. It's an older book, though. I think this came out in the 60s. But I've mentioned before how the more I read history books from the older times, the more I appreciate them. Yeah, so this was first published in 1978 and reprinted in 81. So it's kind of a sweet spot in terms of the intersection of writing ability as well as a level of detail, academic detail. That the writer here is not trying to tell you a fascinating story per se, but he's giving you a lot of pieces of information that you can then take and apply with the information you may already have. Now, this is the Viking shelf, as indicated by my replica berserker here from the Lewis Chessmen. But I'm not going to go into a lot of these are basically coffee table books with the same kind of artwork and stuff that you would expect. This is the Viking Warrior by Ben Hubbard. This is Vikings, the North Atlantic Saga, a book that came out in, I want to say, the 90s or so, probably 95. This is a National Geographic book on the Vikings, notable to me at least, because this was the very book that was in my grandparents' house when I was a kid visiting them, and it was just very fun to flip through the old paintings and so on. So this was probably my first exposure to the Vikings, right? I've got a few others. This is a Pen and Sword title, which I've mentioned I think it's Pen and Sword. I mentioned my misgivings about them before, but no, this is actually Skyhorse Publishing. I'm sorry. I saw the P and the S, but it's Skyhorse Publishing. So this is the Vikings and their enemies with a very... I hate book covers these days. This is just... I mean, it could be much worse, I suppose, but it's just... I'm just not a fan. So this is Warfare in Northern Europe, 750 to 1100 by Philip Line. And it seems all right. It was a book that I picked up very cheaply at a used bookstore for about $5. So it was a nice condition, hardcover. And it seems all right. I just haven't delved into it. Viking military history. How not to fight battles, right? Basically, how to slaughter defenseless monks. We are awesome at that, and we will build up a fearsome reputation on it. Maybe that's slightly unfair, but the Vikings get a lot of pop culture cred, so I feel like poking back at it every now and then. And then we've got an Osprey book on the Vikings here, which is, because it's Osprey, it's going to have, photographs. And the nice thing here is that you do have some nice Angus MacBride paintings in the mix. So there's going to be some very nice, what do we have here? Pictures of artifacts and things. So there's some good stuff in these, but they're more just for flipping through. One that is a little heftier, I guess, is The Norsemen in the Viking Age by Eric Christensen. He's also wrote a history of the Northern Crusades. I think it's the same guy. And that was a good book. He's got a sort of a good, even academic style. This one, I don't think I've read straight through, but it's a kind of book that you can dip into, I believe. It's divided into thematic chapters. So you've got peoples, you've got war, you've got work, you've got emigration, families. So if you're interested in a particular topic, you could just sort of flip to that. There's a lot of data here, and so it is a good read for that purpose. Sort of a research reference, I guess. This is one that I picked up, sort of a general popular history on the Vikings, Robert Ferguson, and haven't got around to it too much because it is one of those popular histories that I just have a hard time getting into frequently, unless they're these masterfully written 3-volume sets by English lords, evidently. But this seems fine, fairly straightforward. There have been so many of these lately that it's hard to keep up, and at a certain point I just stopped getting them. Who is the other guy? Neil. So that's Neil Ferguson. There's another guy who came out with one. What is it? The People of Ash and Elm or something, right? So there's a lot of these books, and there is a great course on the Vikings. Another Kenneth Harl lecture series, if you're interested in that. This is a book we've referenced before in this series, so The Viking Great Army and the Making of England. And this one I was more interested in because the Vikings in and of themselves don't typically interest me, but it's more like how they impact the people around them, I guess. So this one, because, well, I guess I was playing Thrones of Britannia a lot at the time, and you can play as the Viking Great Army, but I like the idea of the changes that took place in England sort of politically, having a lot to do with this great army, which wintered over so famously in the, mid 9th century and caused so many problems. This one, though, is a bit of it's not a bait and switch, but there's a lot of archaeology in here. Let me put it that way. So the narrative will switch to, in 2005, we went to this field and here's what the farmer found, That, to me, slows it down. I'm not as interested in those things, but some people are, and that's fine. This does give you a decent overview. There are some interesting things about settlement patterns, about here was this Viking camp, and what does this mean, by implication for, let's say, the Mercian kingdom at the time. So it makes you think about the landscape and the sort of political landscape in some different ways. So I do appreciate it for that. Viking Great Army and the Making of England. And this is a great one too. Song of the Vikings, so a very, poetic kind of title, but this is not really about the Vikings at all. It's about Snorri Sturluson. So let me just read a bit from the back. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century Icelandic chieftain who gave us Odin, Loki, and Thor, was as unruly as the Norse gods he created. And so this is not about Norse mythology as such. This is about medieval Iceland, about at the time of Snorri Sturluson. And this was a fascinating story. I knew nothing about it. Of course, it touches on, that history. I love maps. So here's a very nice little thematic map of Iceland. It gives you a better feeling for the period. And this kind of got me reading the sagas more, right? Because there's a lot of sagas that are on Iceland, on the families and the family dramas and the politics of medieval Iceland. And that's a topic that had never really interested me until I read that book and I saw the potential for it to be interesting. So I jumped in. All right, now we're going down into Anglo-Saxon stuff. And it occurs to me, I've got a couple of books over here that that are not on the shelf, so I need to go grab those. I'll be right back. All right, so the first one to consider here is the Anglo-Saxon World, Nicholas Higham and Martin J. Ryan. I want to say this is like 2014 or so relatively recent, only about 10 years old at this point. This is a very hefty book, something like 400 plus pages, tons of illustrations, tons of photographs of artifacts, maps, diagrams, and lots of little mini essays, which do a great job of looking at a particular topic. The one I just read this morning was on Gildas, the 5th century monk who probably lived in southern Britain and, of course, was writing on all the problems that existed around that time. And so it just gives you a bit of kind of historical background to the sources and whatever else they want to talk about. There's a little mini essay on King Arthur because the chapter I'm reading right now is Britain in and out of the Roman Empire. So in itself, that is an interesting topic. After that, we're going to get into the origins of England, which refers to, the Angles, the Saxons coming, right? And then after that, we're getting into from tribal chieftains to Christian kings. I'm very much looking forward to that. And then after that, the Mercian supremacies. And so you can see we're still, fairly well along before we even get to the Vikings, which I love because there's when you think about the Anglo-Saxons, I think there is a tendency for people to associate them with the Vikings. because of the popular, interest in the Vikings recently, and the Bernard Cornwell books, the Last Kingdom, and all of that. But of course, to me, there's much more interest in the Anglo-Saxons before the Viking period. So I, in particular, am really interested in the very early Christian Old English period, and that up to the the mid 8th century, I guess, or throughout the 8th century. That was probably the period of Beowulf's composition, to go by some recent arguments made by like Leonard Nydorf, Robert Fulk, I believe, and a few others. So we'll get to the discussion of the date of Beowulf, in a future video when we get into the Old English literature stuff. But that sort of early Christian period of the Anglo-Saxon world, before you had one England, and when you had lots of smaller kingdoms. You had East Anglia, you had, the different Saxon kingdoms. So not just Wessex, but also Essex was its own thing. Sussex was its own thing. I think those were mostly they're independent during the pagan period. But then you had Mercia, which was a pagan holdout for a long time, famously with the person of Penda. Then around 685, or 658 rather, his son, one of his sons, Wulfhere, takes over, becomes Christian. But that's an interesting period too, because the Northumbrian hegemony is starting to break down. The Picts have a resurgency. 685, they beat Edgefrith. Right, fascinating stuff happening all over Britain at that time. And so I really appreciate that this book spends so much time talking about that early stuff, and it seems to give it a fair shake. The only thing I will say about it is that compared to the old classic, which is this, the Anglo-Saxons. What is this? Edited by James Campbell. Coming out in the 80s, I want to say. This book is quite dry in comparison. And there's just something about it. This book is written so well. This book, too, I would say is still worth picking up because of that. It makes a very good introduction. It's also a bit more approachable, right? Because it is not a 400-page tome. It is a much more, not respectable, but a much more doable 250 pages or so. There are a lot of black and white photos, but there are some color plates as well. More importantly, though, the writing, I think, is engaging. It's tantalizing. It makes you want to learn more. It gives you these glimpses of these sort of fragments of historical periods, how they connect with the literary evidence that we have. So this is just, the Anglo-Saxons is just fantastic. So still a really interesting source and probably the best entry point. But this one is probably the best current, sort of standard, at least as far as I can tell. Okay. So that's that. And then we have some other sort of general introductions as well to the Anglo-Saxon period. This one, Geoffrey Hindley. This is a good one for a kind of a general narrative overview. It's not going to get into great detail about anything, but it is going to sort of go through the phases of Anglo-Saxon history and give you a good picture. So I do still find this useful. It's fairly old as well at this point, and it doesn't have nearly as many illustrations, and it's not as rich a resource in that sense. 2006. But it still does proceed it's an easy book to navigate. It's an easy book to just kind of read through and kind of get lost in, at least for me. So I would still recommend, what is this, Oxford? I want to say it's Oxford. No, maybe not. It is Carroll and Graf History. Okay. Regardless, still a good one. And this one, what is this? The Anglo-Saxon Age. This is just an old book. I probably don't need it anymore. I want to say maybe this is a book I picked up in England. Yeah. So that's why I still have it. So I wrote my name in it. Yeah, Oxford, spring 2001. Yeah, so, I got it. I have it now for sentimental value. I don't know that it still holds up. I haven't read the whole thing of it, but it's another one of those overviews, of Anglo-Saxon history, if you're into that. This is a weird one. Aspects of Anglo-Saxon Magic by Bill Griffiths. So, why did I get this book? It's got a neat title, right? Doesn't it? How did I get this? I think I ordered this from Amazon many years ago. First printed 1996, revised and reprinted 2003. So this was back when Amazon sold books. You may not know that they used to sell books, and so I think I saw this, and that was all they did, right? So I was looking at Anglo-Saxon history books. I think this popped up, and I ordered it. It is fine. I have read it, the interesting thing about it is it talks a lot more about Christianity than you would expect, right? Based on a title like this, you'd think, okay, what are we getting into here? But the fact is, we don't have any records of pagan Anglo-Saxonism, right? We don't have really a lot of good literary sources about those things. The only sources we do have talking about paganism in Anglo-Saxon England are from the Christians who were writing about and denouncing those things, and maybe didn't have a good understanding of them anyway. So this is really more about Christian Anglo-Saxon magic in a sense. For example, there are some very famous Old English charms that are preserved in the literature, and we'll see the text in which those appear in some other books later on. So this could almost go in the literature section, actually. But a lot of those charms seem to mix Christian elements, Christian prayers, Latin elements alongside the older runic systems, and references to what seem to be pagan things. So it's an interesting mix. I got it a long time ago. It's not a field that I'm particularly invested in. At this point, the charms and the remedies and all of that, but there is some interest there. One that I do find really interesting, this is a great one, Voyage to the Other World, The Legacy of Sutton Hoo. And so this is a series of articles on the famous ship burial that was discovered in the 30s, I believe, in East Anglia. And we've got some very big names here. Now, this was published in 92. And there's a particular essay in here by Roberta Frank, who I have a great deal of respect for as a writer and, as a scholar, right? I was first exposed to her in an article she wrote called The Unbearable Lightness of Being a Philologist. This came out in the 1990 edition of Speculum, which is a journal of medieval literature. And so she was making a great passioned but also very funny argument for philology, right? This sense of looking at literature, looking at language, right? Looking at what the words mean, and I didn't, certainly at the time I read it, did not understand the context of the, I guess, debates about the nature of the field of medieval studies that were happening then. But I just like the way she wrote, and so she's got a great style. This essay here that appears is called Beowulf and Sutton Hoo, the Odd Couple. And her argument, it seems to me, is that when Sutton Hoo was discovered in the 30s, people had a tendency to look to Beowulf as an explainer, as a means of understanding the archaeological evidence that was uncovered at Sutton Hoo, and simultaneously from the other direction, people who were looking at Beowulf were using the newly discovered archaeological evidence of Sutton Hoo to sort of explain what they were reading about in Beowulf. There's a very famous passage about boar-crested helmets, or that's not exactly what it says in the poem, but it describes helmets. It describes them apparently with boars on the top of them somehow, or ridges with boars, and then we found some helmets with boar imagery on them, right? And so there's been a way in which the understanding of literature, particularly Beowulf, has accompanied the gradual uncovering of archaeological evidence that seems to support or give shape to the suggestions that are made in the text. Roberta Frank is kind of poking back at that tendency in this article. She's suggesting that it's not necessarily a perfect fit that we think of Beowulf and Sutton Hoo as going together. A lot of people did, and they said, boom, there's our evidence. Sutton Hoo came, is uncovered in the 30s. It looks just like something you would expect out of Beowulf. Now, of course, there are some differences, right? A ship burial in the dirt of East Anglia is very different from the ship burial at sea that's given to Scyld Scefing at the beginning of Beowulf. And so that's one big difference, and there are many others. However, Roberta Frank was writing this article in the context of a larger debate about the dating of Beowulf, which happened in 1980 in Toronto. And in that debate, there were many people who were pushing back against a consensus that had built up for centuries, which is that Beowulf was probably written around the beginning of the 8th century, maybe the 7th century, and maybe it dated to the time of Bede, something around that. People assumed that Beowulf was old, basically. But at this Toronto conference in 1980, there were a bunch of scholars who were saying, well, hold on, how do we know that? The manuscript is from around the year 1000, and we only have that one manuscript. So what can we really know? Maybe the things that seem old to us in Beowulf are in fact not old, and maybe they are intended, maybe we can even fit them into the 10th or 11th century. I think this was the view of Kiernan, that at least the argument was made that Beowulf was very late, around the year 1000 or so, or the 10th century, and in the context of these Viking conquests, like King Canute, for example. So that was a prevailing, not a prevailing view, but a prevailing train of thought that had a lot of literary scholars just kind of throwing their hands up for the past 30 years and saying, well, okay, I guess we can't know anything about Beowulf. Who's to say? It could have been written any time from around 600 to 1000. And lately, and almost immediately after that conference, there has been pushback to that. My understanding, though, based on what I've read, is that the English literature types, right, like the English majors, the literature majors, the English studies majors, are not philologists, right? Typically, they're not linguistically trained unless they go into sort of this textual training, and they understand, how you can use linguistic evidence to understand things about language change and what implications that has for dating. And also, they tend to, as people I think tend to in general, adhere to a rather simplistic view of probability and likelihood. So in other words, if there can be skepticism about something, you don't want to seem foolish or open yourself up to being wrong by making a hard statement about something, by making a definitive statement, right? There's a tendency, if you're a scholar, particularly if you're a new scholar, I would imagine, this tendency would be very high to make a sort of a safe claim that can kind of fit with what everybody sort of says, what both extremes say. And so I think you've had, at least I've seen in my reading, for the past several decades, a tendency to treat Beowulf with a kind of a hands-off approach in terms of its date, and to just say, well, we just don't know, it could have been any time. But it's interesting to see the pushback to that. And Roberta Frank is one of the people who I think is arguing for a late Beowulf, saying that essentially, well, we can't really take Sutton Hoo as evidence for Beowulf. And I think she has a point there. That said, I don't really agree with her anymore based on the reading I've been doing from philology types. So anyway, this is a very interesting book. It's not just about the dating of Beowulf. It's about all sorts of other things. Redwald v. Bretwalda is one of my favorite chapters here. This takes a very interesting term, Bretwalda, which seems to mean Britain ruler, or maybe broad ruler, we're not quite sure. And this is, historically has been interpreted as anything from maybe a meaningless back projection of a title that had no actual historical reference to, back in the early days, centuries ago, I think Bretwalda was conceived as being a sort of like the Emperor of Britain or something among the Anglo-Saxons, because Bede talks about it, right? Bede, I believe, uses a term that's similar to Bretwalda, although Bede wrote in Latin, right? So we're already getting into a layer of translation issue. But there are references to kings of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms who could have been considered Bretwalda at various times. We see that moving from, let's say, from the south very early on up to the north, Northumbria, and then going back south again from Mercia in like Offa's day, although he was never called a Bretwalda, but if anyone had a title to be one, it'd be him, and then going down into Wessex eventually. So it's an interesting exploration. Redwald the Bretwalda. Redwald was a king of East Anglia, sort of in the early Anglo-Saxon period. And so, and again, I love that period. That to me is the most interesting Old English period of history, at least now. It changes. But anyway, so there's all sorts of other stuff talking about Sutton Hoo. The least interesting stuff here is the very detailed information about the burial itself. Like there's someone had to write about coins, didn't they? Someone did have to write about coins. And like, the coins are great. We need numismatists, right? The nature of the Sutton Hoo coin parcel. And so there's a lot of, here's these coins that we found, lists of them. And then there is some discussion about the implications of that. What does that mean? There are some very interesting things we could say that the coin finds suggest about the nature of trade and maybe power in East Anglia. So very fascinating book. Voyage to the Other World, The Legacy of Sutton Hoo. Now, even though this is an old book, I think it still has great value. Speaking of, dates and East Anglia, this is the other book that I had to get because I'm reading it currently, The Origins of Beowulf and the Pre-Viking Kingdom of East Anglia by Sam Newton. Now, this came out as a response to that Toronto conference, right? This came out in the 90s, I believe, 92, 93. And he makes this argument that there is a relationship. He's going to propose a hypothesis that Beowulf was composed in this milieu, right? Like not Mercia per se. I think he's going for an East Anglian connection or origin even. And so I'm very excited to get into this. He's making arguments that cannot be 100% proven. And that's what I was saying earlier about probability, right? If we can't prove something 100%, there's a tendency to just throw up your hands and say, well, I don't want to look like a fool by making a claim for an early Beowulf, so I'll just say it could be this broad range. But I really appreciate people who say, this may not be provable 100%, but here's a hypothesis that fits with the evidence. I'm going to lay out that argument as I see it, and let's see if it takes us anywhere, right? Maybe we can, someone years down the line can find some interesting piece of evidence to fit in with this hypothesis, and maybe that will lend support to something, or maybe it will be disproven, who knows. But in the meantime, it's good to have a story, right? So I really like that someone took the time to make this argument, even though, it's certainly impossible to prove it 100%, and it may be disproven at some point. I still think we need that. So very interesting book, The Origins of Beowulf and the Pre-Viking Kingdom of East Anglia, and it's fairly accessible too. There is some tough going in the beginning because he talks about the manuscript a lot. If you are new to this stuff, I would recommend just maybe skipping and just jump in to chapter 2, the question of the poem's origin. And this will give us sort of a good overview. He also doesn't seem to have too much of an axe to grind, right? He's making a very clear argument. And I think he went to school in the area of East Anglia too. So it's kind of, I appreciate it. He's not pushing too hard for his alma mater or anything, but it's nice to see. But regardless, he doesn't seem to have a great deal of hostility or animosity towards the late daters of Beowulf. So it's a good one. Okay, so that's out of the way. Now, here's another couple of essays, really. Imagining the Anglo-Saxon Past. And this is two separate, fairly lengthy papers, I guess. The Search for Anglo-Saxon Paganism and Anglo-Saxon Trial by Jury is the other one. So the Search for Anglo-Saxon Paganism is interesting because, how do you find it, right? Like, probably the best evidence we have is Bede, right? I mean, literarily speaking, historically speaking. And otherwise, we've got archaeology, right? We've got the literature, but, like the Old English poetry. But what can we really use that for? Because a lot of that has a very explicitly Christian bent anyway. So it's an interesting question, right? How far can we analyze that? And the question of Anglo-Saxon trial by jury is also interesting because that's another sort of sacred cow, I guess, in how the English view themselves as descended from the Anglo-Saxons. The idea of the trial by jury starting among them is one of those points. So anyway, this is kind of poking holes at a couple of important ideas, I guess, or things that maybe need to be examined more closely. But this is a fairly old book too. I want to say the 80s. Okay, yeah, 1975. But then he did a reprint in 2000. So for whatever that's worth. Not really my area, but again, kind of an interesting one. Now we've got Faye Sampson, Runes on the Cross, the story of our Anglo-Saxon heritage. So this one has a few red flags going off for me. I not enough that I was scared away by the $3.50 price tag though. So I thought this is maybe a precious, nice, good feel book. The story of our Anglo-Saxon heritage. So it's an interesting one. It seems like a fairly naive book. Maybe this is a cruel thing to say. Who's Faye Sampson? She lives in a Devon village. Her 26 novels for both adults and children include the Dark Age fantasy series Pangur Ban. So there's that's the Irish monk and his cat, Pangur Ban. So, she's writing about the Anglo-Saxon church, and I think the organization here is a little strange. She clearly has fond feelings for things. That's okay, but I don't know that she has enough of sort of a scholar's sort of toughness, I guess, to really give it a fair look. But it could be sort of an entertaining book. I haven't gotten into it because I've just found other things to read. Now, here's how you would do a fond feelings for something, but still be scholarly. This is Northumbria in the Days of Bede by Peter Hunter Blair. Fantastic book. I want to say 70s. Let's see. Let's find the date. Yeah, 76. That's exactly what I thought it was. And this is just a lovely, lovely book. Every few years I will get this. I think I've read it maybe 2 or 3 times, but it's wonderful. This is written by a scholar, by a historian, who also wrote this, Roman Britain and Early England, 55 BC to AD 178. And so this is, AD 871, 178, reading it exactly backwards. But yeah, so this is, as you would expect, Roman Britain, Early England. This is another old one. This is more dry because it is, a more scholarly overview of a historical period. This 1963. But this is a fun read too. And this one is just a beautiful book. He clearly has, again, a fondness for Northumbria. And through it, I too developed a fondness for Northumbria in the Days of Bede in particular. At the back, there's a quote, very kind of rare. There's no blurb, but it does say, "Never give up the study of letters, but have such young men with you as are always learning and who rejoice more in learning than in being drunk." And that is Alcuin of York, who went down to teach Charlemagne, right? Pretty much. So anyway, this is... I just don't know what to say about it. Just get it, read it, enjoy it, because it is a very, very enjoyable book. It talks about, the warlords, the saint hero kings, but it talks about the saints too. It talks about the more monastic style saints, and there's a lot of just wonderful anecdotes, things from Bede. If you haven't read Bede, that's a great entry point to it because it sets in context, the political, the historical period, how Christianity had been proceeding through Britain, and then you can go on and read the ecclesiastical history of the English people with that sort of beautiful background. But it's worth revisiting on its own. So Peter Hunter Blair. All right, this one's maybe a little embarrassing at this point. Saxons, Vikings, and Celts: The Genetic Roots of Britain and Ireland by Brian Sykes. And so I can't remember how I was first exposed to this, but I think probably this was a purchase. Yeah, got it from Borders. So, guess what my genetic profile is, right? It's all from basically this part of the world and also France and Denmark a little. But it is essentially, British. And so, this is who are my people kind of purchase type of a thing. And the answer is just a lot of people, right? It's so many that it's almost impossible to trace, and sort of the attempt to differentiate the different lineages on one relatively small island over many, many centuries, and how that may have an impact on who you are as a person. You got to make a claim at some point for who you are as a person, regardless of what a genetic implication might suggest. Here is a feels like a pen and sword book. Yes, it is. Battles of the Dark Ages. And this is kind of a winceable pen and sword book in my view. So it does focus on British battlefields AD 410 to 1065. So it focuses on specifically, let's see. I mean, there's got to be Hastings in there. Okay, so the Saxon conquest, I think that talks about the Wessex fighting the Welsh around Somerset, something like that. Mountbatten and Arthur, the battles for northern England. Dunnikin, Destiny in the north. King Egbert and the Vikings, the battles of King Alfred. Brunanburh, the Battle of Malden, and then Athelred. So it doesn't actually have Hastings. So that's interesting. So yeah, it focuses on the battles, but really there's a lot of local British stuff which doesn't appeal to me, because I'm not a local British person and I don't have a vested interest in where specifically the battle was fought, because there's particular villages that have laid claim to this is where the Battle of Brunanburh was, and then archaeologists will come around and say, well, no, maybe it wasn't, and then people will get mad. So there's all this kind of local politics that I think takes up a bit too much of the book. This is a very interesting one. Stephen Pollington has written a ton of books, sort of popular history, I guess, but very, very focused, on the Anglo-Saxons. And so this one, The English Warrior from Earliest Times till 1066. What I like about this one, in particular, he talks about, the weaponry and sort of what the symbolic resonances might have been for these various weapons. And I think it was reading this book that I got the idea, or I got the impression of a sort of a difference in meaning, right? Between the sort of the typical, sword of the period, the sort of the full-size one-handed slashing blade, like 3 feet long kind of a thing, and the sax, right? The much smaller sidearm, I guess you could say, or just a glorified knife. But some of these could be very long. And I think it was in this book where he talks about the sax being kind of a suspicious weapon, having not a sort of heroic connotation to it, but the kind of thing that you'd stab it up under in a shield wall, and that maybe that implies something about how people would have felt about kind of an underhanded weapon. So anyway, I just like that. I think he was going into some literary evidence potentially. But one of the things you have to do, unfortunately, is flesh out your accounts of Old English stuff with Norse stuff, because we just don't have a great deal of specificity on the Anglo-Saxon history, especially if you're using the literary evidence. The poetic evidence is very vague. There are a lot of terms, for example, for swords that appear in Old English texts, but I don't know that anyone has ever gone through them and said, oh, here's what Bill really means, here's what Mecha really means, here's what Swerd really means, here's what Heru really means. And those are all, I believe, just different words for sword, and we don't know why, right? We don't know exactly what the connotations are. This is a book that does try to answer that question, The Sword in Anglo-Saxon England, by Hilda Ellis Davidson. Kind of a classic in this field, although it is by now very old. I think came out in the 50s. No, 62. But nevertheless, I picked it up because I felt I was doing a lot of research into Ents. And so there's an Ent-made sword, but by which I mean the Ents, not the J.R.R. Tolkien Ents of Lord of the Rings, but the word Ent as an Old English word referring to giants or ancient peoples who came before. And there are a few instances where that word is used in Beowulf and in other Old English poems, as well as sermons and things like that. So I was doing some research on that, and the sword in Anglo-Saxon England seemed like a good one to pick up. And it was. Okay. But there's actually, I think, not a newer version, but another book that does kind of the same thing, which I haven't yet bought because it's fairly expensive. But if you look for Swords in Anglo-Saxon England on Amazon, I'm sure you'll be able to find whatever that is. Its name escapes me. But this is an Osprey book, the Anglo-Saxon Thane. So basically the entire Anglo-Saxon period in like 70 pages, as is typical for an Osprey book. There's some decent pictures here. The artist is Gary Embledon. This is the best, unquestionably the best. Right here. Who is this? Is it Penda getting killed? The death of Ethel here at the Battle of Winwed. 655 or 665? Yeah, 655. So anyway, there's some very nice art. Good overview of the period. This is a handbook of Anglo-Saxon food, processing and consumption by Anne Hagen. This is another title in the Anglo-Saxon Books series, who did a lot of Stephen Pollington's stuff, as well as this aspects of Anglo-Saxon magic. I don't know if the publishing company is around anymore, though, sadly, because this was a really great source for kind of, I don't want to say amateur, but this is, you get the sense it's not written by like titanic professors, scholars in the field. This is written by people who have done a lot of research, have done, let's see, recreations, right? Have made the food in this case, have recreated the armors and armor in other cases, and, you know, done a lot of reading in the field, done a lot of writing in the field, but are more like independent scholars. And so I really like that there was such a place for that. Let's see who Anne Hagen is. I have not read this one. Let's see, do we have any? Okay, abstract. So this is probably a student. Yeah. This is a project she did at University College London, I guess. So anyway, this is a... okay, here's information about the author. So she was born at Kempston, Bedford. And she had a number of jobs, from toffee apple wrapping to metallurgical analysis. She read English with honors at University College London, taking Anglo-Saxon archaeology as a special paper. Then she worked as a museum educational officer before becoming an English teacher. So this is someone, you know, who has... sort of a good grounding in the field, but she's not a career scholar in it, right? And I love that you could have sort of a publishing company to provide places for people like this to publish their work, because otherwise it kind of gets overlooked. And so people like me, who are also in a similar situation, I suppose, right? Not a career scholar in the field, but very interested and tries to keep up with it, can benefit from seeing what other people have done. This is a wonderful book, Mercia and the Making of England by Ian W. Walker. This has done a lot to sort of correct the picture in my mind of England as a ultimately Wessex project, right? The idea that we get, as he lays out in this book, is that for a while you had the Heptarchy, right? These are the 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Wessex, Kent, something like that. And those fought amongst each other for a while. Northumbria was big, then Mercia was big, but then finally and triumphantly Wessex took over after Alfred the Great, right? And that is a generally fair outline of things, but it sort of glosses over the fact that Mercia didn't simply die during the Viking period. I mean, the kingdom did go through a lot of problems, right? It was basically decapitated and cut in half and chunked up and given to Wessex. But it did play an interesting role, even up until the very later period. And so I like this sort of as a regional history, but also importantly as a kind of a corrective to the Wessex-focused history. Because a lot of the history we get was produced in Wessex, right? So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle started under Alfred the Great. Then you've got Asser's Life of King Alfred to sort of, again, give us that perspective. And again, there's nothing wrong with that perspective, but between that sort of Wessex focus and Bede's Northumbrian focus, we don't have anything really similar for Mercia. And it's kind of surprising because they were a dominant force in the middle sort of Anglo-Saxon period and even fairly later. And so this book does a great job of kind of correcting that and showing what they did, how they were sort of intertwined with Wessex later on. So a very enjoyable read. Okay, speaking of Alfred the Great, though, we've got a few books on him. This is Asser's Life of King Alfred, and it also includes some other contemporary sources. This is a Penguin Classics version. And so we've got the translation and introduction and the notes written by Simon Keynes and Michael Lepage, two famous names in Anglo-Saxon studies. So this also has selections from the various Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, King Alfred's laws, his will, and extracts from his own writing, together with this life of Bishop Asser, who was a Welsh monk, I guess, who got called over to Alfred's court and wrote his life story, although I don't think he completed it. So that's an interesting sort of contemporary read. And again, why do I not have the Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica here? Well, it's over in the literature section because it seemed more like literature than Asser did for whatever reason. So we'll get to it. And then some sort of general reflections, scholarship on Alfred the Great. This one, War, Kingship, and Culture in Anglo-Saxon England by Richard Abels. Again, sort of a good overview. We've got a much older one, Eleanor Duckett's Alfred the Great, the King and His England. This is, again, very sort of a popular book, 1956. I read it, though. There was a time when you couldn't find these books very easily. And so something like this, the fact that this would even end up on a bookshelf, in my town, just randomly, it was kind of strange. But I picked it up. It's sort of a fun read. It does seem like it's intended for either a very general or a younger kind of audience, but a decent intro. And this is one I haven't read, Kings, Queens, and Runestones, the story of Thyra and Gorm. So this is about Denmark. And the reason this is here is because it is actually related to England, right? So a lot of these people are related to English kings. And so it's interesting that this is trying to make the case for sort of a connected North Sea culture or system, as would certainly be the case in the later centuries. Here we've got a book that's now 25 years old, The Year 1000, What Life Was Like at the Turn of the First Millennium, An Englishman's World. So this is a book with 3 titles, so it's serious stuff. Somehow this book is not super pretentious, despite that. And despite the fact that it's got 2 authors, Robert Lacey and Danny Danziger. So this was one that I think this was a recommendation from my favorite professor in college. And so I bought it, ordered it, or whatever it was. And this is actually, it is very charming. So this one basically takes Alfric, or Alfrich, who was an abbot of Eynsam, I guess it was, in Dorset, somewhere around there, southwest England, essentially. And he was a very prolific writer around the year 1000. So Alfric was writing sermons, he was writing saints' lives, and he was also writing other things. One of the things he did was sort of a schoolboy's text called the Colloquy, which is a sort of a series of dialogues between a teacher and a pupil. And the idea was that this would give younger students a way to practice Latin, essentially, so that they could become priests or whatever they needed to become, monks. And in doing that, and giving those series of dialogues, Alfric also gives us some great insight into what it was like at the time to be a farmer or a fisherman or whatever. And so that sort of text, along with some calendars and along with some late Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, is where we get the story here. And it's full of just these neat little details and tidbits. And so it's not anything like a history in the classical sense. It's not at all a narrative history or even a discussion of things that happened in the year 1000. It's more of a general, here's what these little kind of peripheral texts that most people are not aware that they even exist, that are typically not taken seriously by like literary scholars. Here's what these little texts can tell us about life, about sort of the everyday. So it's that type of book. That has become a bit of a cottage industry these days. It seems like, I remember when that started though, when you first saw books with like the title of Salt, and you think, why am I going to read a book about salt? Like seriously? But that, over the past several decades, that thing has really caught on. We may be seeing the end of it now, I guess, although I don't know. We do tend to see every now and then these books crop up with very specific claims or focuses that make claims about their importance for, the broader world, I guess. So here's another one completely different in focus. This is Queen Emma and the Vikings by Harriet O'Brien, a history of power, love, and greed in 11th century England. Fascinating story, actually. And so it lays out, for those of you who aren't aware, the many husbands and children of Emma. And she was a woman who was married to, I think it was Ethelred II, the Unready, so-called. And then she was later married to Canute, King Canute. And she had a couple of different sets of kids out of the result of those marriages, I believe. She was the great aunt of William the Conqueror. So there's a lot of just very interesting things here. So Emma is a fascinating character and definitely worth a read there. Some more late stuff about the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. This is the Bayeux Tapestry and the Norman Invasion. I can't remember where I got this. Probably, it's definitely a used bookstore purchase. And it's nice because it has basically the whole manuscript, all in. Let's see if I can show this here. Well, you get the gist. You've seen the Bayeux manuscript or the tapestry, right? So it's got the whole thing all laid out. And that's really nice because I didn't have any book that had that. So you can just flip through it and see it all. So that's good. It's also got an introduction to it. Kind of a nice little reference. A very famous, but by now rather old, introduction to the Norman invasion is 1066, the year of the conquest. And it sets out these characters, right? It's very much a character-driven story. I want to say this came out in the 60s. 77. But you've got, the big personalities, right? William the Conqueror himself, Harold Hardrada of Norway, Harold Godwinson of England. And then, all the circumstances that brings them together. So this is a kind of like a fun narrative read of that story. And then finally, the last one on this shelf is Blood Feud, Murder and Revenge in Anglo-Saxon England. And this is also the late period, and it goes even post-conquest a little bit. So this is a fascinating story. Whatever, we can certainly argue about the claims that it makes for blood feud as an Anglo-Saxon kind of institution, right? I think there's been some pushback against this book because it seems to, or may actually suggest that blood feud was like a sort of an institutionalized thing. But I think it can't be disputed that there were such things, right? Whether or not we would say that they are sort of an official or even a very common thing, there do seem to have been a lot of murders and not a lot of sort of centralized institutional power that would prevent them. And so people and families took things kind of into their own hands. And so this tells the story of a particular family in northern England, and then, their various backstabbings and feuds. So it's a fun read, really interesting read on those grounds. But maybe, just treat with caution because there has been some other discussion to come out, in the intervening years since that was published about 20 years ago. So that's it for my Byzantine, Viking, Anglo-Saxon history, although we will be revisiting all of those moments later on when we get into more literary stuff, which eventually we will do. Coming up next, though, we've got some more like British history. So again, my history section is organized a little differently, but we've got stuff that focuses on, like, say, Roman Britain, the various histories of, like, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, right? Those types of things, like northern Britain, the Britons who lived in like southern Scotland, northern England, those types of things. We get into more general medieval things as well. We're going to get into Frankish history, the Crusades, and things like that. So it should be a good time. Hope you join me for that. But until then, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions or recommendations, and I'll see you in the next one.